Alright, so I've taken our simple web application, copied it, and created a new application called Forms Authentication. And I've added a login page, which I'll show you in a little bit. And I've added a web.config file, which I'll show you now. The web.config file, the first thing it does is it denies anonymous requests. So it's going to require everybody to be authenticated. And the authentication mechanism it's going to use is Forms Authentication instead of Windows. Alright, so if I point my browser to this thing, actually let's just grab it from here. Browse to the default page. You'll notice that instead of seeing the default page, I'm immediately redirected to the login page. Now if you think about it for a moment, there was two things that caused this redirection to happen, and this is useful to think about this. If we go back to the web.config, the first thing that happened is we came into the web application without a cookie. So Forms Authentication module during Authenticate Request event basically said, oh, this is an anonymous user. It set up an anonymous user context. The authorization module, the URL authorization module, matched that anonymous request and denied the request, turning the request into a 401 unauthorized. That started to go back out to the user, but the Forms Authentication module caught that on the end request event and turned that into a 302 redirect to the login page. Now the login page isn't specified here. The default login page is login.aspx, and that's what I've gone ahead and implemented here. So here I collect a username and a password, type in the username, type in a password, hit login, and you'll notice that I'm not going to press the login button just yet, because I want you to notice that, let me zoom in a little bit here for you. Woo. The return URL that's shown here is actually collected from based on the page that you tried to go to. So I tried to go to default.aspx. When I was redirected to the login page, the Forms Authentication module remembered where I was attempting to go, so that when I log in, it can return me to the page that I was trying to go to in the beginning, which kind of makes a lot of sense. So when I hit login, what you're going to see is you're going to see a cookie issued. You guys can't really see that. I'll show it to you, and I'll show you the cookie in a minute. But you'll see that we're able to now get to the default login page because Forms Authentication module is seeing the issued cookie, and it's cracking that thing, finding the name Keith, and setting up the user context. And you'll notice that the authentication type is now Forms. All right, so I want to show you what this cookie looks like, just so you're aware that it's there. If we go into Internet Options and Internet Explorer, and we go into our browsing settings and view files, we can see the cookie that was issued for localhost. And if we take a look at that, you can see that the name of the Forms login cookie by default is .aspxauth, and then all of the rest of this stuff is base64 encoded goo that is essentially encrypted. It's encrypted by default, so you're not going to see the name Keith in there anywhere, but somewhere in there, encrypted, is the name Keith, and that's what's being pulled out and cracked when this cookie gets sent back to the application. Every time I refresh this form, what's happening is the URL authentication module is reading that cookie and decrypting it and pulling out the username Keith and setting up that user context with every request that's happening. Okay. Now I can click the logout button and log out. What that'll do is it'll just clear the cookie. And when we try to get back to default.aspx again, of course, it's going to fail. It's going to redirect us back to the login page just like before. Now let me show you some of the code behind this. If we take a look at the code for the login page, it's really easy to issue a Forms Authentication cookie. There's a method on a class called Forms Authentication, a static method called redirect from login page. And when you call that method, you pass into it two things. You say the name of the user that you want to set up. That sets the name in the cookie, and consequently the name that you're going to get every time you go and look at the user's identity. So you get to control what that name is. And then you can also specify whether you want the cookie to be persistent. By persistent, I mean it'll show up on the user's hard drive, or because I've said true here, it shows up on the hard drive. I did that specifically because I wanted to show you what the cookie looked like. If I had said false, instead, that would only be in the browser's memory. It would have been a little harder to demonstrate it using Internet Explorer. Now, obviously, one of the most important things you need to be able to do here is authenticate the user. And all I'm doing here is just passing in the username and the password to a little helper function that I've written called isAuthenticUser. And for demo purposes only, I'm just checking to see that the username equals the password. Don't do this in production. Obviously, you'd want to look up in a database or something. But in my next lecture, I'll show you an example of a provider that you can use to get this feature implemented for you in a more robust fashion. Now, one other thing I wanted to show you is the logout button. If we take a look at the logout handler for that logout button, all it does is just calls a method called signout, which simply expires the cookie. And then I redirect the user to the same place that they tried to get to, which is the default page. And that essentially ends up redirecting them back to the login page because they're signed out. The reason why I do this is because I want to redirect them to the default page first and have it automatically redirected to the login page. That way, when they type their name and password into the login page and click login, they'll be redirected to the page that they were trying to access, which is this page right here. So that ends up working out pretty well.